In all my years of poring over old cases, few are as befuddling, mysterious, and most of all embarrassing as the one I'm currently shaking my head at today. Capcom, one of the most prolific and famous video game publishers in the world, has seen their fair share of hard times, but as many know, hard times don't last, but hard people do, and Capcom has weathered many a storm. One of those storms ushered in some cold fronts that blew through the halls of the Osaka-based company in the early 2000s, which, innocently enough, started with a string of surprising announcements that would leave long-lasting effects. See, unlike many of their competitors, Capcom was hitting their stride in the move to next-gen consoles and 3D game development, bolstered by big franchises like Resident Evil, Onimusha, and Devil May Cry. These series were primarily being handled by Production Studio 4, a cabal of their most respected young talent, comprised of experienced visionaries, disciplined producers, and of course, a few rebels. These were the people who opened up a new chapter for Capcom, away from the scan lines and quarter munching of the arcades, and into console-exclusive, darker titles molded after, yes, Resident Evil. And that word there, exclusive, is kind of the whole linchpin of all this, because in late 2002, Capcom would announce to the world that their high-rolling creators were unleashing a new generation of titles and characters that, according to them, would reinvigorate the gaming industry. It was doing fine, and all through the cubic power of Nintendo's newest machine. They did no such thing. This is a case I like to call the fantabulous failure of the Capcom 5. To get to the bottom of this, we're going to need to roll it back a bit all the way to the salty, dusty year of 1996. Despite many of Capcom's biggest successes coming from the slot of the good old Super Nintendocom, the decision that its successor, the Nintendo 64, would drop the CD medium altogether was incredibly boneheaded. Doing this cost them the support of many of their former chums, including Capcom, who only put out 3 titles on the machine. Although, gotta give Angel Studios credit for cramming good old RE2 on there.
What are you doing here?
My name's Leon. I'm with the RP.
Whew. Sorry about that, babe.
Weirdly enough, though, there was lots of love for the Game Boy Color, but for Nintendo's home console division, there certainly were some bridges that needed to be rebuilt. It was around this time that Shinji Mikami, the head of Production Studio 4, was sniffing out partnerships that would play host to his group's upcoming titles. Of the big 3 options, Sony wasn't really in the running. Mikami had some beef with them, so they had an audience with Microsoft first, who just so happened to be desperately seeking out any and all Japanese creators to make content for the Xbox, or, as it was known in Japan, the thing that takes up 70% of all the square footage in our house. When he asked Microsoft representatives what was behind the company's philosophy and their game-making process, they were caught off guard and simply stammered and gave a weak reply. Mikami then pondered for a second, bowed slightly, and left the room, vanishing into the night. One of the Microsoft bigwigs, Kevin Bacchus, was present, and since he didn't speak a lick of Japanese, asked what the hell just happened. Once the Japanese interpreters explained, raucous Bacchus was mortified, as he would have given a very clear, rehearsed answer. By the time Microsoft got back into touch with Capcom to schedule another meeting, though, Mikami was being coddled in the warm, loving bosom of Nintendo. Oh, but don't feel too bad, Microsoft. Capcom is more than willing to give you your own top-notch exclusive survival horror epic. This Resident Evil switcheroo was made public in September of 2001, just a month shy of the GameCube actually launching. It would encompass the remake, Zero, and, well, you know the rest. This partnership was going well, and with Mikami being so impressed by the nuts and bolts of the GameCube that a follow-up announcement was set for November of 2002 that would show just how much support Capcom was willing to throw Nintendo's way. A grand presentation at the lavish and exclusive Velfair Club in the swinging district of Roppongi. I never know how to pronounce this, and people always give me shit. Roppongi. Okay. Up in the swinging district of Roppongi was scheduled, with a glut of Japanese and foreign press in attendance, their lips parched and their keyboards quivering for whatever this was going to be. Capcom then trotted out their superstars like show ponies, dressed up in flashy jackets and shiny pants. For all intents and purposes, they were rock stars. Each one took to the stage to present the project they were working on, although very little palpable info was revealed. First up was the already known but at that point mysterious Resident Evil 4, which at this point was at the airship version, I guess, produced by Hiroyuki Kobayashi and directed by Hiroshi Shibata. It would release in the near future of 2000X. I'm not yanking your Johnson, it actually said that. Capcom then rolled out 4 brand new games, with Shinji Mikami, the Godfather, overseeing them all. The first title was the one he had the biggest hand in, though, which was PN03, or Project Number 3. A futuristic third-person shoot-'em-up with a squeaky clean art style and a shapely doll by the name of Vanessa Z. Schneider. While interesting, this was certainly a stark contrast compared to what Capcom had been producing for the last 2 years. The appropriately named Dead Phoenix was next, a gorgeous-looking flight-based fantasy action shooter that featured an unnamed hero blasting through an unnamed world. It was to be directed by one Hiroki Kato, the director of Code Veronica, and of all the titles shown at the event, elicited the strongest reactions from the crowd. Following that, we saw the little devil himself, Hideki Kamiya, dressed to the nines in his finest leather getup, introducing Beautiful Joe, the one of the 4 new games that seemed most in line with Capcom's history, a colorful beat-em-up action game that leaned into Japanese superheroes and Fred Durst. Then finally, amongst a throng of unique titles came the most unique of them all, Killer 7, made not by Production Studio 4, but rather Grasshopper Manufacture, and directed by Suda51, who of course came out dressed as a member of the Killer 7 Masked Smith, before dispelling with a disguise and presenting his neo-noir FPS third-person shooter action-adventure hybrid. Now, revealing 4 brand new franchises from one company in one single event is rare nowadays, since there is such a strong reliance on sequels and remasters, so you can imagine the ripple effect this all had. Even more ludicrously, all the titles were slated to be released the following year, save for RE4. For that, you'll just have to wait until X, I guess. All of this was a bit of a shock, as the whole event went down with little warning in Japan, with much of the Western world catching some Z's when it was live. But almost as important as the games themselves was how murky some of the messaging was. Capcom then opened up the presentation by saying, "We believe that the regression of excitement is solely the fault of the responsibility of we creators. By the same token, we believe it is also our mission and responsibility to create something that is worth seeing for the user. In a market that has become prosaic with character-dependent games and sequel games, we would like to take this opportunity to announce 5 new and exciting games for GameCube." At no point were any other machines mentioned. In fact, on Capcom's website, which recapped the event, it said, crystal clear and with no error in translation, "For the growth of the gaming industry. For GameCube." Now, as simple as that was, it would of course need to be confirmed, reconfirmed, and then confirmed again by various media outlets. Capcom was bombarded by questions for days and weeks following the announcement, asking for clarification if these titles were indeed GameCube exclusives, which was seen as a bit of a mistake, as the PS2 wasn't only performing way better as a console, but Capcom games were making some serious dosh. Coupled with that, the previous Resident Evil exclusivity deal really really made it seem like Capcom was simply doubling down here, very much setting the stage for that assumption. Fortunately, however, an official memo was eventually sent to the press, straight from Capcom themselves, and dispelled all the confusion with a frank, no BS statement that said, all of the 5 titles announced on November 14th in Japan are for the GameCube only. Well, I'd say that's as concrete as a pair of galoshes, so let's move on. Now, project number 3 was, January 2003 at a Gamers Day event in the city of Sin, Las Vegas, Nevada, almost 2 months after the initial unveiling, Capcom in a squeaky, almost terrified voice clarified that all games, save for RE4, were not in fact GameCube exclusive at all, but instead could very well see or not see ports in the future. This revelation, or by Capcom standards revelatons, occurring in an early 2000s online environment was tantamount to heretical betrayal. Just imagine nowadays if Capcom announced that a new Dead Rising was going to be exclusive to the Xbox, and then later said, oh, did we say exclusive? What we meant was, okay, bad example, but you get my point. A promise of exclusivity is the fuel in which powers the raging war machine that is fanboyism, so assuredly the bodies were stacked high on IGN Insider forums that day. Now, while this is a disastrous PR nightmare and the fact this vague statement exclusivity lasted an ice age in internet time, this wasn't the only foible which befell the Capcom 5. With the next one being the fact that project number 3 was the first of them to hit store shelves and had the "from the creator of Resident Evil" marketing angle slapped onto it. Being the standard bearer for this huge Capcom Nintendo blood ritual was an unfair expectation to be placed on Vanessa's shoulders. This was not a trendy, epic third-person action-adventure, but rather a simplistic, almost arcade-style shooter. The slinky dame moved from identical room to identical room, quickly dispatching waves and waves of robots with precise laser shots, while deftly moving out of the way of incoming fire. Clearing each area as fast as you could with as little damage as possible earned you the best ranks, and that's it. It was very light on cinematic story flair or intriguing side quests, no NPCs, no real exploration. It was more like a modern take on Defender or Space Invaders, played from a third-person perspective and featured a mysterious lead who let her blasting do the talking. The game also had a steep learning curve and stiff controls, offering much less in terms of options when stacked up against other action fair releases of the day. So it was clear that this was not the best choice to be the first out of the gate if Capcom wanted to make a good first impression, and perhaps going in hard with all the glitzy press conferences and presenting their creators like they were gods maybe colored expectations, just a tad. It also didn't help matters that Capcom's recently released offerings like Onimusha 2 and the Resident Evil remake were a bit more impressive and in vogue when compared to Mikami's efforts here, despite how unfair that really is. So due to all this, Ms. Schneider was hit by poor reviews and even poorer sales, and has been blacklisted by Capcom ever since. So the Fab Five were sputtering out of the gate, and things only started to get worse from there. When Dead Phoenix failed to show up in Capcom's E3 2003 lineup, an event where both Killer 7 and Beautiful Joe were featured, people were a bit worried. When the game's actual listings started disappearing from all websites and press releases, that's when people got a lot of worried. To this day, Capcom has never given a direct reason for its cancellation. It was essentially never spoken about again. But 2003 was a rocky year in general for the company, as they also canceled Capcom Fighting All-Stars and Red Dead Revolver, which is originally intended to be a successor to Gunsmoke, or Gun.Smoke. Capcom then relinquished the IP and also the immensely talented Angel Studios, who went on to become Rockstar San Diego. Stepping back a bit and, looking at Capcom's 2003 as a whole, you start to see a whole lot of flim-flam. Devil May Cry 2, Group S Challenge, Dino Crisis 3, Mickey's Hide and Seek. Hey, why wasn't this part of the Capcom 5? Then there's Onimusha Blade Warriors and the Gregory Horror Show, which absolutely no one remembers. They took some chances that year, and many of those chances did not pay off. In one of the few bright spots, Beautiful Joe did release later that summer, and while it garnered great reviews, it didn't exactly set sales charts ablaze, but it did decently enough to bang out a sequel the following year. But at this first sign of trouble, Capcom announced Joe was getting a PS2 port, which touted extra features and a whole new character, something I'm sure lots of GameCube fans appreciated. The entirety of 2004 saw 0 appearances from that initial lineup of the Capcom 5, despite 4 of them all being slated for the previous year. Shinji Mikami, knowing that RE4 could absolutely not fail, took the reins of development and directed it himself, further reiterating until it took on the form we're all familiar with today. However, RE4 had been in and out of development since 1999, and Capcom higher-ups were growing frustrated with mounting costs and low sales of the things coming out of Production Studio 4, and thus started to make their own moves to negate those mounting losses. They mandated that as many titles as possible needed to have multiple ports to mitigate risk, and despite his dislike of the PlayStation brand, Mikami was powerless to protest. Beautiful Joe 2 Henshin a Go-Go'd onto the PS2, followed by Killer 7, but there was still the big one, Resident Evil 4. Now remember, that big survival horror cross GameCube megaton earlier in 2002 wasn't some vague verbal promise, mind you. RE4's exclusivity was a part of an inked written deal twixt Capcom and Nintendo that they simply decided to break. The PS2 version was announced several months before it ever hit the GameCube in early 2005, which was always sort of baffling. Why would any company do this? Just shut the hell up, let the original version sell as much as it can, then months later announce the PS2 version to maximize sales potential. All this did was really hurt Nintendo. Mikami and various other creators within Production Studio 4 were furious, as many of them felt their projects were not being given the marketing muscle that had initially been promised. To appease them, Capcom set up Clover Studios and gave the group more autonomy, which you can hear more about in another case file. Not very long after, though, Mikami and several others eventually had enough of Capcom's practices and decided to leave the company altogether, leaving their bosses little choice but to shut Clover down. What Capcom had learned during this whole messy affair is that they needed more ports, or at the very least, go all in on the winning horse, that being the PlayStation 2, which enjoyed a number of exclusives, much to Mikami's chagrin. The overhyped and underwhelming nature of the Capcom 5 and exclusivity deals, both real and imagined, disrupted a lot of their business in the mid-2000s, with 2003 and 2004 being particularly dire years for the publisher. And even though they corrected their statements on exclusivity, many people still feel that the Capcom 5 was just a bunch of empty promises. Only one title wound up being a GameCube original, and in terms of critical reception and sales, happened to be the worst one. But where are they now? Well, Hideki Kamiya has dug in deep with Platinum Games with more than a few memorable titles to his name. Mikami returned to the concept of an arcade-esque shooter where a white-armored protagonist took on an army of robots in a short but sweet adventure before returning to survival horror once more. Hiroki Kato of Dead Phoenix infamy would also go on to Platinum Games for a spell before exiting the video game industry altogether to become a farmer. Now that's a career change. The one person who seemed to benefit the most out of all this was Goichi Suda. Grasshopper went from an almost complete unknown in Japan and a full unknown in America to being the guys that made Killer 7 once it achieved cult status and appreciation years later. Even though it didn't sell gangbusters and critics were divided on it, it truly was his breakout hit, and Grasshopper is still going strong to this day. What's worse is that this whole debacle made it so Capcom and Nintendo were no longer 100% copacetic with each other, as the GameCube saw less and less support after that, while any games the Wii were graced with usually wound up being cheap ports or spin-offs. There's even a rumor that Nintendo carried that bitterness in their hearts long enough to not even approach Capcom for a guest character slot in Super Smash Bros., despite inviting both Sega and Konami, Capcom's competitors, to the brawl. It took almost a full decade and many ports of RE4 later for the relationship to have finally been mended. It's a tale of misplaced expectations, miscalculations, and most importantly of all, miscommunications. Capcom took those big risks in 2003 and it simply didn't pan out. It was the wrong time, with the wrong franchises, and it eventually cost them some of their most valuable talent. It very much seemed that the creators of these games were giving it their all, but the business side of Capcom started to get cold feet very quickly, and immediately started backpedaling and second-guessing just about every other decision. It's what actually pushed the company, later led by Inafune, to invest in a big Western push, as was the style at the time. At the very least, this is all certainly an event that marketing executives of today and the future can look towards and say, "Whoa, damn, yeah, let's not do that." And thus, the case of the fantabulous failure of the Capcom 5 is closed. If you'd like to suggest another seedy tale from the underbelly of the gaming industry, just drop a comment in the video below or walk into the offices of the Flophouse VIP Patreon to officially nominate the subject of your choosing. Until then, I'll see you next time, here on the Flophouse Files.